Well, welcome, friends. We are so glad that you are here. I am looking forward to this conversation as part of the ongoing work in the midst of COVID. I want to give a couple of shout outs and thank yous, and then we will pray and dive in and swim around in these waters together. First, I want to give a shout out to Virginia Theological Seminary, where I currently am. Greetings from Alexandria, and especially to the Department of Lifelong Learning. Catherine Malloy is working in the background here, doing tech and monitoring the chat. And I am so grateful for the entire team. They have been really helpful in pulling things together and doing details that I might have missed otherwise. And then a shout out to my Zoom coffee hour people. Under the midst of the pandemic, I have bubbled with Lisa Kimball and Trisha Lyons and Altagracia Perez-Villard and Cynthia Ballard-Perez. You probably saw our introductory video and then the video on discerning next steps with Altagracia and Cynthia. But as we have been trying to figure out how to do worship and fellowship, that group of people has been a lifeline for me, and I am deeply grateful for them. I'm also grateful for the movement of the Holy Spirit in our midst, and so I would like to start us with prayer. You can give us that slide, please, Catherine. The Lord be with you. Let's pray. Loving God, you see your children growing up in an unsteady and confusing world. Show them that your ways give more life than the ways of the world, and that following you is better than chasing after selfish goals. Help them to take difficulties or failures not as a measure of their worth, but as a chance for growth and a new start. Give them strength to hold their faith in you and to keep alive their joy in your creation. Gracious God, fountain of all wisdom, enlighten by your Holy Spirit those who teach and those who learn, that rejoicing in the knowledge of your truth, we may serve you from generation to generation. Through Jesus Christ our Lord, who lives and reigns with you and the Holy Spirit, one God, forever and ever. Amen. Amen. So just a brief description of why this webinar. COVID-19 has brought educational issues to the surface that have been in the water for a long time, but many people could ignore. And lots of you have already noticed this, but a few examples. One is the digital divide, that there are households that have multiple devices, that have a strong Wi-Fi connection. On the other hand, there are households without internet, with spotty Wi-Fi, especially in certain areas of the country. And then there are the equity issues, vast disparities of funding for school districts that are right next door to one another. Nicole can talk about that, the story of two different schools and how just crossing a geographic line can change the kind of school that you have access to. What we've noticed is that schools are trying to figure out how to meet the educational needs of students safely and effectively in the midst of pandemic, with unfolding data and with competing and often contradictory recommendations. How do they create socially distant spaces? How do they ventilate them? How do they keep them clean? How do they pay for those modifications? What about students with special needs? What about students who depend on meals at school? What about students who don't have access to computers or Wi-Fi at home? What about students who are homeless? And then we've heard a lot from parents who are trying to decide what's best for their children, emotionally, socially, and academically. Do they send them to school, either fully in person or with a hybrid mixture that includes online components? Do they keep them home with a fully online format? Do they create small pods with friends or neighbors? And if so, how do they decide who becomes part of their pod? Do they shift to homeschooling? And if so, which curriculum do they use? And what about parents who need to work full time at home or elsewhere? And then right at the center of things here at VTS, we have heard from churches that are trying to discern how to meet the needs of people in their congregations and in their communities more broadly. Which programs should they keep or change? Which partnerships in the community should they develop? And this is where our webinar arose. We want to figure out how to help churches do the work in careful and contextual ways, including insurance and liability issues, federal and state policy issues, and the specific needs of each community. And what we're hoping is that you'll take all of those things and look for the movement of the Holy Spirit and join in that work. Catherine, you can go to the next slide. So I want to do brief introductions of each of the webinar participants, and then I will turn the microphone over to them so that they can tell you a little bit about the organization that they work for and with and what they're seeing on the ground. So I guess I should start with me. Welcome, my name is DeGaynor. I'm Assistant Professor of Practical Theology and Christian Formation here at VTS. I'm originally from Michigan, the West Side. So Michigan people, we always hold up the hand. Nicole's gonna do that too, and she's gonna show you the other side of the state. And I attended public schools from K through 3, and then transferred to a private Christian school for 4th through 12th grade when funding cuts meant that academic programs weren't gonna be as strong at the local elementary school. So from a very early age, my parents taught me to care about education, and I'm grateful for those lessons. My vocation as a professor, as a scholar, is to build connections between the academy, between the church and the world, particularly through teaching, which I've done at multiple levels, from tutoring kindergartners, and I spent a decade as a high school English teacher in Virginia before heading to Duke for graduate work in theology. My areas of research and writing include the history of schooling, public, private, charter, and homeschool in America. I'm currently working on theological analysis of online pedagogies and exploring the relationship between contextual theology and public policy. Next up, Raymond Pierce. He is president and CEO of the Southern Education Foundation, an organization that is over 150 years old, well done, and whose mission is advancing educational opportunities for African American and low-income students in the southern states. The Southern Education Foundation's focus on policy research, education legislation, and leadership development. Prior to joining SEF, Raymond was Dean of the School of Law at North Carolina Central University, and before that, he served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of the U.S. Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights in the administration of President Bill Clinton. He's originally from Ohio. We've decided to forgive him for that. Sorry, Raymond, I couldn't help it. He attended public schools K through 10 and then a private prep school for grades 11 and 12. And I think that I have this right. He's also lived and worked in Arkansas, North Carolina, and Georgia. Is that right?
That's correct.
All right. BA in English from Syracuse, JD from Case Western, and most recently, a Master of Arts from the Divinity School at Duke. I'm proud to have been one of his instructors, although I suspect that I learned as much from him as I tried to teach him.
I doubt that.
Next slide, please, Catherine. Susan Penick grew up in South Carolina, and her dad was a public school administrator. She told me that she graduated from a rural public school, even though many others had left during white flight. For the past 5 years, she has been serving as a consultant to Congregations for Children, the acronym is C4C, an initiative of the Western North Carolina Conference of the United Methodist Church. She's passionate about coaching communities of faith in collaborative response with children's and families impacted by poverty, especially in rural settings. She's committed to supporting local solutions built on relationships and partnerships of churches and public schools. She's a provisional elder in the United Methodist Church, and she currently serves as pastor of St. Paul United Methodist Church in New Ellenton, South Carolina. She has a BS in mathematics And she has a master's in Christian practice from Duke. She graduated a few years before Raymond. She was also one of my students, and she has inspired me to keep my work close to the ground in the lives of people, and I'm grateful for that. And then finally, Nicole Baker Fulgham is from Detroit. She attended a Lutheran school K through 8 and then public school for grades 9 through 12. And she is a fellow graduate of University of Michigan, go blue. I'll pause for a second for you all to cheer for that. She taught 5th grade in Compton, California before receiving her doctorate in education from UCLA with a focus on urban education policy and teacher preparation. She's the founder and president of the Expectations Project based here in Washington, D.C. This organization focuses on early childhood education, quality teacher preparation, and advocacy toward racial justice. They've been doing this work of compassionate service since 2012. She's the author of 2 books, Educating All God's Children and Schools in Crisis. Christianity Today named Nicole one of 50 women leaders influencing the church and culture, and she speaks regularly at national faith-based and educational conferences. We're so glad to have each of you. Catherine, you can go to the next slide, please. Just so you all know how to set your clocks, what we're going to do is I'm going to give each of the webinar participants about 10 to 15 minutes to talk about their sense of the landscape here in America currently, what the problems are, what the potential solutions are. While that's happening, if you want to post questions or comments in the chat, for the last 15 minutes or so, we'll come back together and talk those through. All right. Raymond, you, sir, are up first. You can unmute and talk to us, please.
Yes, ma'am. Well, thank you, Professor DeGaynor. It's an honor and a privilege to, one, to be a part of this, and 2, to have been one of your students. And whenever you call on me, I'm going to answer. So I hope that I'm able to participate in a meaningful way here. As Dr. DeGaynor said, the Southern Education Foundation is 152 years old. It actually was formed out of philanthropy, Northern philanthropy. Actually has its origins just before the Civil War, when actually George Peabody, considered one of the wealthiest men in the nation at that time, was arguing that the United States was getting behind Europe, that the Europeans were making money with machines, the industrial age was coming, and the United States was getting behind. It was wedded to this agrarian economy. And not only that, they had half the labor enslaved. And so the war ends, and many of the philanthropists from the northern states realized that the Reconstruction effort was neglecting this large population of new citizens, people of African descent. And so he put up $1 million to buy books and train teachers and build schools. Shortly thereafter, another millionaire by the name of John Slater, who actually was an abolitionist, who opposed slavery and enslavement, rather, on moral grounds, put up $1 million to do pretty much the same thing, hired former U.S. President Rutherford B. Hayes to run the program for him. And then third, Anna James, who was a Quaker woman, considered one of the wealthiest women in the nation, out of Philadelphia, who was a leader of the abolitionist movement in Philadelphia, made her money in the insurance industry. She put up $1 million to train an army of Black women teachers called the Jeans Teachers, and to build schools and to buy books. There were other funds, private philanthropy funds in those early years of Reconstruction to get African Americans educated. Large Christian influence, largely from the New England churches that they spoke out strongly against the enslavement of Africans in North America. They were the ones who were putting up the money in the early days to get this education started in the South. Somewhere around the 1930s, all those funds were consolidated. Most of them were consolidated to form what is now the Southern Education Foundation. One thing that I want to mention is that in the early days of private funding for education in the southern states, early on, the philanthropists, particularly the George Peabody's team, was saying, look, we can't keep paying for this. And that's what private philanthropy will say today. They will give you money, but they're going to ask you what? How are you going to sustain this? And so it was the Peabodys and later the Slaters, they were arguing that the folks in the South, particularly African Americans and poor whites, need to do the same thing that the Northerners did, and that is create a tax base to pay for public education. There was no public education in the South. That if you all remember the Horace Mann movement, that Horace Mann movement pretty much stopped at the Mason-Dixon line. And back then it was called universal education or mass education or common learning. Today we call it public education. It was easy to get people to pay taxes for bridges and roads and maybe even the Army. But if you ask someone, hey, I want to raise taxes, you got to pay taxes so we can educate everybody, people say that's crazy. If you want your child to receive an education, you pay for it. Education has historically been private. And in the United States and even in Europe, if a child received an education, it was either because their parents had the money or they sent them to a local church. And the church would teach them how to read and write. And their reading was mostly scripture. So it was the private philanthropy during the Reconstruction period, while the federal troops were still occupying the southern states. And African Americans were elected to office in large numbers as state senators and state representatives. It was private philanthropy that drafted the legislation and put it in the hands of these elected Black state senators and state representatives in Mississippi and Alabama and Maryland and Virginia and the Carolinas and Tennessee. And they took that legislation and took it down to the Capitol and introduced that legislation, and it was voted into law. Years later, when the federal troops were pulled out of the South, the leaders of the South, what they called the planters, the white elite, said, okay, we're going to end this taxation, but it was actually poor whites that rose up and said, hey, wait a minute, this is good for us too. Let's keep this. Let's just keep it separate and segregated. And again, private philanthropy rose up and opposed that, fought against it for years, but obviously that was a losing battle. And over time, those funds just became separate and unequal. Southern Education Foundation has always found itself over the years in that spot of opposing the segregation of public education, of supporting the funding of public education. So you bring that here to this day, and during this era of COVID-19. And Professor DeGaynor can tell you before, because I was actually in school when I took this job to run the Southern Education Foundation. It just happened to me. I had to take a term off to get my head around it. But early on, putting the Southern Education restructuring the Southern Education Foundation along the lines of what I told my board of trustees that I would do, it was focused on the research, getting the research operation running again, to do the analysis and the data gathering to find out where the inequities are, where are the problems, and how to go about closing those gaps. It was developing a legislative network, a network of state legislators, similar to what the Southern Education Foundation did in its early days, state elected officials who can vote policy in. I was putting all that together, and then earlier this year, COVID-19 hit. Now, when COVID-19 hit, it causes social justice organizations like mine that are focused on education to really get busy. And as you all know, as Professor DeGaynor said, this COVID-19 has really highlighted the big disparities in public education throughout this nation. They were always there, but now they have been highlighted and even to some degree intensified. I actually served in the U.S. Department of Education as an appointee for President Bill Clinton when we worked on something called the E-rate. And the E-rate was a federal program designed to address the digital divide, because as the internet came into being during those years, the early mid-90s, there was no internet before that of any note. There was a quick realization that there are going to be haves and have-nots in this, that the internet can be a good tool for education, but there's a divide between those who have access to it and those who do not. And that's when the term digital divide first came into being, somewhere around 1994, 95, 96. And so the federal government put a lot of money out there to get districts, school districts in areas of the country, rural areas, wired so they could get access online. I got to tell you, that was years ago. And when I took on this role to run the Southern Education Foundation, I was not aware that that digital divide still existed to this degree, and it does, and it is massive. And so now we have all these students who are at home learning remotely, and we could talk about so many issues, but one fundamental issue is many of them live in areas where there is no reliable access to the internet. There's just no reliable internet access to the internet. And there's no small wonder that that lack of access correlates to income, to poverty, and socioeconomic status. So we early on, the Southern Education Foundation early on put out guidelines to school districts. I think we called them equity guidelines for remote learning in this area of COVID-19. That talks about access to the internet, it talks about laptops, it talks about training teachers and working with parents so they can work with their children at home. Now, here we are, find ourselves fighting on two different fronts now, because not only are we fighting this issue of all of the challenges with remote learning, and there are many, from teacher wellness, the stress on our teachers teaching at home, doing remote teaching, the stresses on parents at home who are also working at the same time at home and making sure that children learn. But now we find ourselves in a situation where we are confronting accelerated efforts to, I'll just say it, raid the public dollars, the public funds to send to private education. This has been a historical situation. I mean, for over 100 years, there have been efforts to take public funds and use them for private education, particularly around the area of race. That is historical in this country, but it has been accelerated in recent years here now. We actually have directives coming out of the U.S. Department of Education now from our Secretary, Betsy DeVos, to expand something called the Equitable Services Rule. The Equitable Services Rule is a part of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, has been around for quite some time. It says that school districts receiving federal funds can allow a percentage of those public funds to go towards private schools, but that percentage was always tied to low-income students attending private schools. Now, the Department of Education under Secretary Betsy DeVos has just issued regulations, guidelines to expand that to include a percentage of all students attending private schools. So it's not just poor students attending private schools. They're saying all federal funds to support public schools, a percentage of that goes to private schools, can go to private schools. And the formula to determine that is if you live in Jones County, South Carolina, and 20% of your students go to private schools, then 20% of federal funds for public education should go to them. That will be devastating. That's a lot of money, folks. That will be devastating. So the Southern Education Foundation, Friday, we actually joined in litigation in Washington, D.C. The case is the NAACP versus Betsy DeVos. And we just submitted an amicus brief supporting the plaintiffs in that case to stop our Secretary of Education from what we believe is this misguided effort to detract and divert much needed public funding for public schools to private education. You know, I attended private school my last 2 years of high school. I received a scholarship, and what wasn't covered by that scholarship, my mother and father worked and raised the money to send me there. We couldn't even afford for me to pay for the school bus to take me out there. So I actually rode with the janitor. The janitor at this private school lived in my neighborhood, and I rode with the janitor to the school. But that's a sacrifice. You want a private education, pay for it. The public option has always made this country great. You want to talk about what makes this country great? I'm going to start preaching here, Dr. DeGaynor.
Preach.
You want to talk about what makes this country great? It has been the public option. Public libraries, public parks, public highways, public bridges, public streets, public trash collection, public waterworks, public utilities, and public education. People can have private museums, they can have private parks, they can have private lands, they can have private, if you have the money, you can pay for that. But what makes this country great, which brings equity, which raises the boat for everybody, is this public option. And so that is why the Southern Education Foundation and other civil rights organizations and social justice organizations find ourselves on the front lines defending this public option.
Yes.
Because it's only in education where you see a raid on these private dollars. Well, on these public funds. You see a raid on the public funds. I suspect that's also going on with the raid on the public lands out west also. There's always this raid, this greed on the public option. So I'm not gonna, I don't know how much time I got left, Professor DeGaynor, but
here's what I would like. Raymond, you've done such a good job of giving us an overview of the history and of tying together the relationship between money and advocacy and policy, especially in the South. So what I'd like to do, I do want to come back to the lawsuit against the education department, but I want to give Susan and Nicole a chance to talk. So let me turn to Susan Penick next, and let's hear what's happening in her sense of things in North Carolina and South Carolina, please.
Okay, Liz, thank you. That's wonderful. I will pop through some things. Liz has asked me to speak specifically more on the ground, boots on the ground, and what's happening in local communities. I have been working in Western North Carolina. It's the Western North Carolina Conference of the United Methodist Church. For those from other places, North Carolina has two conferences. So the North Carolina Conference of the United Methodist Church and the Western North Carolina Conference of the Methodist Church, both are doing the initiative C4C, Congregations for Children. We've been doing that together for some time. But I want to name that they are contextually different and the conferences are different, so they are run different. So I'm speaking to the work that we're doing in Western North Carolina, although I hear fabulous things in the North Carolina Conference. I think in this amount of time that I'll just speak to around the core beliefs. There are core beliefs that we've done. I've been doing this work for 20 plus years, creating partnerships with public schools. What we have primarily done over the last few years specifically, is we've been doing workshops, training sessions, coaching, technical assistance, and helping two layers. One layer is the church and school partnerships on the ground, individuals sometimes, and another is helping communities in collaborative, more of a kind of a collective impact model, create work that is working together for the children. So those are the two things that we have been primarily doing in our partnerships. Now with COVID, we have partnerships. I'm going to start with partnerships. I have a good friend who's a good Episcopalian, Bill Milliken, who always said, programs don't change people, people change people. And it's about relationships. And one of the things that we talk about is relationships in every aspect of what we're doing. So right now we have churches calling who haven't been in partnership, and they're saying, I want to start a partnership. And then we have churches who've been in partnership for 20 years or 15 years, and they have solid partnerships. So that's all very contextual in both on the ground and in where they are in their relationships. And so the first thing I would say, we probably have churches out there today who are wondering what they can do, and maybe they're not in partnership yet. And I would say, first of all, our schools are dealing with it's just unbelievable what we're expecting of public education today. They're dealing with logistical challenges. They're learning new platforms. They're trying to keep children and educators and families safe. As always, we tend to dump everything on our educators. And as they're doing that, I know in North Carolina, school has been back for a few weeks. This is not the time to go marching into a school and say, I have an idea, okay? What we need to be doing is contacting our schools, those who've been in partnership or not, but understanding that right now they're consumed by the work, and not to be surprised or frustrated. And I've heard it recently, well, they don't call back, or I'm not getting an email back. Well, there are reasons. They're pretty busy right now. But to listen when those conversations occur right now is to listen to what they need and do it, particularly our Title I schools. We can have two schools across the street from each other. One has everything they have, parents involved, all this, and the one across the street is just in dire need of basic supplies. So the main thing to do right now is to listen to what their needs are. We've heard some recently, we're hearing everything. And I will tell you that much of the work we've done for C4C has been in empowerment models, really focused on literacy. But this is a time where we're backing off, and there's a lot of relief effort going on that's needed. One school this past week, I need all the earbuds I can get. I need all of the children's face masks. We've got churches out there making face masks. Make some for children. First, find out if your school needs them, but we need face masks. We need all of those things, hand sanitizer. We've got children coming in that don't have food, supplies, families that electricity bills aren't being paid because they still haven't gotten any relief effort funding. And so all of this is coming back into the school door. So listen and respond accordingly. A lot of it right now is relief effort. I will tell you one thing that's really changed in the last bit too, is years back when we started this work, we heard a lot of people, particularly for our Title I schools, asking for support for the educators. I'm hearing that more and more and more right now. And so simple things, people are putting together goodie bags, breakfast bags, notes, cards. I've had people recently go back to something we did back in the 90s, which was these prayer partners where a teacher is matched with, if a teacher wants it, is matched with someone from the congregation, the community to pray for them. But what that does, it does a few things. First, the power of prayer, but it also gives that teacher in that classroom who is trying to do too much, just has too much on their plate, a direct link. So when that child has a need, when there's a need in the classroom, there's not red tape to go through. It's text my buddy, let her go back to her organization or her Sunday school class, and immediately in this crisis situation, get the people they help when they need it rather than waiting. Collaboration is the other component that I would say is always what I want to name is these core beliefs. We have lots of core beliefs, but these are the ones that have really been magnified during this pandemic. Collaboration is always important. We should not be working in silos. As a church and as a community, we need to be working together and making sure, think about this right now, if you're the local school and 12 churches of different denominations are calling you, asking you for help, what a mess. So this is a time for the community to get, if you're not organized, first of all, if you're a church who's not in partnership, find out who is. Reach out around your community, see who's collaborating, who's already doing the work, and if they're not, help them bring that. We're doing monthly Zoom calls, bring people to the table, have forums with parents, with churches, with organizations, and do those things. One of the things that we hear from the school system on the ground is this digital divide. It is about both access and consistency. So it is both a rural and an urban challenge on different levels. One of the things that we have been doing that's a practical thing, which I know you're interested in, is different churches, different denominations, they're all in different places when it comes to risk factors. So we have churches that have upgraded their Wi-Fi and have their parking lot available where you can get access to a code to use parking lot Wi-Fi. We have churches who have opened their doors where they will allow parents to come in with children. And we have churches who are doing learning centers who actually have someone staffed. We're seeing all of it. The key, particularly in all communities, but in our rural communities, is know what the others are doing. Don't just knee-jerk react and do it until you know what's needed, because what might be needed is one church may already down the street have it. What they need from us is not opening our facilities, but what they may need is volunteer support and supplies and other things to be a part of it. So in one of the initiatives that we're doing, the school system just asked the collaborative that we work with to gather that information from the community. So the church is actually making the contacts, finding out who the Wi-Fi spots are, where are they, and so that the school system can get that information out. The other thing is that very often in our central areas, there's lots of access, not lots of access, but we can get to access, but there may be places out further where there are neighborhoods, but there's not access. So the churches, I implore you to think about that and to not just think about people in your immediate area, but how can you come together and offer funding to a more rural church to help them get their Wi-Fi where it needs to be, where that's where the kids need to be gathering, if that's the place that they can get to, because transportation in rural areas is just a constant issue that we face. I think in a call, I've had a number of calls with schools and what's going on. I think what I would add in closing is this, and I want to say two more things if I have time. One is church.
Go ahead, come on, Susan.
Okay, do not, in the midst of this, we are all about social justice. I know that I've spent my life in this, but do not underestimate the power of prayer. Do not underestimate it. And I will tell you that in the last few years, we've been doing a pilot in 2 counties in North Carolina. The Duke Endowment has funded us to do these 2 pilots. And we began merely with a church in each community, finding the people from their church, from the community, to come together weekly for 6 months to study contemplative prayer, to pray. And this was the call. They also studied models of relief to empowerment, but this was the call for them to help the community find their prophetic voice on behalf of children and families impacted by poverty, to be the voice of the children who do not have a voice.
Amen.
And in doing so, what they did is they began, it's just been amazing to watch what God has done. And what we've ended up in those 2 communities are collaboratives and meet monthly. And at the table is the health department, social services, the school system, Partnership for Children, other agencies, other churches. And now all of a sudden what they're doing, people who've lived in the community forever, didn't even know what the others did sometimes, but they're working together as systems change. They're talking about, this is what we're doing with children, and on the ground, they're finding ways to make change in the systems in their own communities. We've spent a lot of time working on education around racism, around all the divides that happen, and it's been a beautiful thing to see God at work in the midst of that. Look for the prophetic voice. What is God speaking in the community? And then finally, I will close with this. While we are looking for all of these ways to help children right now, this is the time to prepare for post-COVID. We have children that are going to be coming back to schools that might be as much or more as 1 year behind. And what can we be doing to prepare for post-COVID? We've been running summer literacy programs. So instead of VB at Bible school and those types of things, add it to 2 or 3 weeks and turn it into a literacy camp. Work with the school system, get teachers in, do workshops for parents. Whatever it is you do, don't make it hard, but make it transformational, and look at it from that lens of what can we be doing post-COVID to make those plans. This is the time, if there aren't collaboratives in your community, to develop them. This is the time that if there are collaboratives, get in the game and push it forward and to make sure things are happening. We are, the names of things that I would name that we are seeing boots on the ground is, I've named the basic needs, everything from face masks to emergency needs to kids, earbuds, technical support. How can we be creative and making sure that our families get what they need? Sometimes that's technology, sometimes that's Wi-Fi, whatever that might mean. Learning centers are not only going to be needed now, they're going to be needed when this is over. We need to get serious, church, about after school programming for children. We just,
Preach.
yes, get serious. Classroom support for teachers. We have churches right now that are providing space for support services because schools are very often limited on space. So a classroom can be held for the speech pathologist, and that's where the children come in. So there are creative ways to use the space in that way. We have churches now who've extended working with Head Start programs. Our Head Start programs need support. And it's a wonderful place for the church to be engaged. A lot of work has been happening around literacy in the initiatives that we work in. So collecting, buying, getting books out, they're going out. Churches are putting them in laundromats, in doctors' offices, in the schools themselves are sending them out. The social services that go meet with families, churches are putting together packets with educational packets to get into the hands of kids. Meals where we used to gather and have a meal ourselves have turned into meals to go for families. Opportunities to support families with things they seriously need. Advocacy. So in our meeting a couple weeks ago, one of our meetings in one of the counties, as we gathered, we had a legislator from North Carolina on there. We wanted to know what's happening right now in Raleigh when it comes to the digital divide, when it comes to nurses in schools, what's going on. And we work with NC Child, who also has advocacy information that goes out, and we're getting that information out in the hands, emails out, so it's easy. So the people in our congregations can be writing letters and making phone calls on behalf of our children.
Thank you.
I will close with this. Don't underestimate the prophetic voice. Don't underestimate it. I spent 20-something years in this work, and it's only been, I'm embarrassed to say, the last few years that I put a focus there in the work. And it is amazing to watch what God does when people of God get behind it and believe that and listen to that and watch, because our communities are so contextually varied and different, and the needs are. And local people need to own it. They need to own it. We need to be a voice. It is a disgrace to live in a country where nearly 25% of our children are impoverished. And that number is deceiving because we have an unacceptable poverty line. So there are so many more that are in low socioeconomic situations, and we should be embarrassed as a nation for what we have. And I believe the voice of the church is imperative right now.
Thank you, Susan. I'm so grateful for your pragmatic, prayerful, prophetic voice. Nicole, I'm turning to you. How does it look from where you're sitting?
Sure. Hello, everyone. I lead an organization called the Expectations Project, and our mission is to build a network of faith-motivated advocates for education policy and systemic change, particularly as it relates to education inequality. So our organization has, as of right now, as far as we know, the nation's largest network of faith-motivated education equity advocates. And we have a network of about 50,000, close to 50,000 advocates who are all over the country. And they are people like you. If you're not one, feel free to go to our website and sign up. We focus on educating and equipping and mobilizing people of faith to speak truth to power in their local, state, and national education context, so we can see essentially the needle move on systemic policy change. So we love all of the local efforts that many congregations are doing with public schools. Ours does that too. That said, we also know that the local work that we're doing alone isn't sufficient, and so we try to get people to look at what are the policy issues that are causing the conditions that force us to need tutors for every child in every class, or that force us to have to provide books for kids as volunteers. Why is the system that currently exists allowing that, right? So in this particular context of COVID-19, our organization has really shifted our focus to, I think, I won't repeat a lot of the comments that have already been said, ensuring that our advocates can support funding initiatives at the state and local level for technology in this moment. We've been very involved in a lot of the federal legislation, particularly the one that was mentioned at the beginning from my fellow panelist, Raymond, that Secretary Betsy DeVos looking to divert Title I money to private schools. And as was said, I'm a product of both private and public schools. An urban Christian school my parents would have loved, I'm sure, some additional funds when they were scrapping to send my brother and I there as a working class family. But I actually believe public school students are the majority, and our organization believes that they're the majority of kids. And we believe that there should be another set aside of money in this season to support particularly private schools that may be working with the same population of kids. We have no problem with that, but don't take it away from public money that's it's earmarked for kids in low-income communities. So we were very involved in that initiative. Actually, of the thousands of people that made public comments on that, when that opened up for public comment, about 12% of them were people from our network, which we were very proud to see just the way they've stepped up. Since COVID, our network has taken over 40,000 individual actions on education equity issues in this season. The last thing I'll say is that we're also, so I know we want to get to questions, I think, in 1 minute. The last thing I'll say is that, it's all good, it's all good. Good questions, I'm sure. We want to make sure we have time for that. The last thing I'll say is that we're also very focused on policies and systemic change as we come back from COVID, whatever that means, that focus on issues of trauma, knowing that kids, particularly from more vulnerable communities, and Black and brown kids were more negatively impacted by coronavirus from an economic standpoint, certainly. And so there are lots of kids that are living with economic uncertainty, which breeds trauma that impacts kids negatively. there may be students who are still dealing with food insecurities, but I would say, honestly, it's the health implications from COVID. Black and brown families were disproportionately impacted by that. My family was impacted by that. We lost my father actually to COVID, sadly in April. And I think about just the impact of having to navigate that. We have a 14-year-old daughter, and she's in a home that does not have a lot of other, financial insecurity. But the grief of navigating losing her grandfather, watching her mother and her grandmother and her uncle, like all kind of go through this season, and knowing that those kids are all coming back to school this fall, and whatever version of school is, the Washington Post estimates that I think it was a third of African-American families know someone who has died of COVID, as opposed to like 9% of white Americans. So that's real. And to think that those kids aren't coming back bringing those experiences and that trauma while they're still sitting on Zoom calls, which the only reason we're Zooming is because of COVID, right? Like the reason I'm sitting here, probably not talking to you in person, is because of the thing that many families in the Black and brown community have been devastated by, right? Devastated by. And so we are looking for school districts to be able to provide more mental health and emotional support resources for our families. And I think there's a role for communities of faith to step into that space as well. And
Nicole,
with that, yeah.
Right. Thank you so much. First, I want to offer my condolences. I'm sorry that your family was hit by COVID, and that grief
Thanks.
is part of how you are responding. But I appreciate your naming how mental and emotional health are on the table too for students and for parents. And I think sometimes in the urgency of things, we were only thinking about one level, and you have helped us name the multiple levels of what's going on and what is needed. I have 6,000 questions to ask, but I want to honor the audience. Catherine, you have been monitoring the chat. Do you have a question or two that you want to give us from them? Come on.
I do, absolutely. As a children's ministry at church that's already pretty overwhelmed with trying to do worship and Christian formation and such, what is one small step that a Christian formation person in a local church can take to help?
That's a good question.
That's for anyone.
Right. Who wants to take that one? What can churches do in formation ways? So on the church side rather than on the school side, that'll be connected somehow.
So I'm gonna name what I've named, which is at first to pull some people together as however you can, whether that's Zoom or not, and to pray, but not loosely, specifically about this issue, specifically about the children and the families and the educators in your community. I would suggest finding someone, a volunteer perhaps, to help really even do some contemplative prayer. Parents are stressed. So if you're looking at the formation within your church, parents are stressed, children are stressed. Looking for ways. Now, one of the challenges we have is a lot of people are zoomed out because of school. But that would be where I would start, would be who, and see, and let the Lord work from there if you're looking internally. That group can do things for a local Title I school that a Christian educator does not have to do.
That's
So
right.
Also be looking at ways to have ministry that the church owns it.
And that's part of the empowerment model that you were talking about, Susan. I think there's something so important about asking young people what they need, what they're seeing, what they're afraid of, what they're grieving, how they want to serve, and then finding ways to allow them to do that. Thank you. Catherine, do you want to offer the next question?
Sure. This one is kind of a leading question, but I love it. It's, might responding to the needs of children also meet the needs of older adults who are seeking meaningful opportunities for ministry in the midst of COVID and fear and isolation?
Right. Well, I'm going to start taking this one because in our Zoom office hours in the 3 weeks leading up, one of the things that we heard over and over is how there are a lot of elderly congregants who are feeling lonely, but they want to help. They want to be part of the community. They want to be part of this network. And we heard so many creative responses, whether it is an elderly congregant getting on Zoom and reading stories, or a socially distanced gathering, or volunteering even behind the scenes, right? So that the health risk is lower, but that there is some engagement. So I think that intergenerational ministry and service is so very important. But Susan or Raymond or Nicole, do you guys want to respond to that question beyond what I have said, given your congregational work?
Well, I'll name one thing that I'm dying for someone to do. And
Come on.
I'm going to say it hasn't happened. We think in terms of bringing the kids to the church, you know, and supporting and doing the volunteering and whatever we're doing. I would love to see a church that would do a socially distanced, organized, safe for children on Zoom or some platform where in a safe way, it brought volunteers together that were going to be with children, and they read with children online, but it does it in a way so a small group of elderly people are connected to the classroom or whatever that situation is with kids, but it also offers them, if it's done very carefully, a place where they feel safe.
I like it.
You would tell me, because I'm dying for somebody to do it.
Right. Well, plant the seed here. Catherine, I'm going to pause you for a second. I want to make sure that I want to give each of the webinar participants a magic wand, but not actually magic. If you could make one change or one suggestion or one tool that you would put in the hands of people to deal with the problems, especially on the margins, young people who are poor, young people who are in minoritized populations, young people who are in unsafe home settings, young people who are dealing with mental health issues and are trying to do school. What do you want for them? Raymond, your mic is on. You want to start?
That's what I get.
Put you on the spot.
Oh my goodness.
And you can pass if you want to.
Well, no,
I bet Nicole has thoughts.
that's a very good question, particularly when you put it in the context of a magic wand, and that's exposure. If we could build greater attention, I mean, the marginalized, the disenfranchised, the poor, the excluded, are often invisible. They're just invisible. They just don't get the attention. We know they're there. They don't have lobbyists. They don't have people, who are paid to go to the city council or the school board to argue on their behalf, or to go to the state legislator, or my goodness, United States Congress, to argue on their behalf. They're just struggling. And so if we could just lift them up, first of all, as Susan said, in prayer, lift them up in prayer, put them before God. That's what we're supposed to do as children of God. But, here in our political order, at least call attention to them. We all have our own selfish needs. I understand that, in terms of our children, our community, but there are other communities that are far less fortunate than ours. So if I had a magic wand, what I would do is, somehow put these people, highlight these people, highlight this population and give them the attention and exposure that they need.
It's a really good answer, Raymond. And for Lisa Kimball and others who are doing work with the baptismal theology and the sense that we are knit together with one another, that might help us care about other people's children and counteract the I'm just going to care for my own, which is unchristian, y'all. Nicole, how would you respond?
I think for me it is this isn't really a policy prescription, but this is a mindset shift that I would wish we would have, is for us all to be able to view every single child as an individual that has potential, and not just to say it, but to actually believe it, and to not let the circumstances of a child's life, where they were born, how much money their parents do or don't have, the language they speak, to not let that sort of cloud what we see as potential. And also then with that, to believe that it is our responsibility as Christians and people of faith to work to ensure that that actually comes to be for every child. Like that's, I know it's easy to say it, but there is a significant mindset shift that I think we would have to make, rather than like blaming families and like gosh, if they just cared more, right? Like if we could shift that culture as a nation, but also I would start with us as individuals and as people of faith within our congregations, and to really have the honest, like, let's peel back where those ideas for all of us, right? This is not like sort of pointing fingers. This is all of us working on that.
Yes.
And delving into that, and what hinders us from doing that, I think would radically change what we do and how we think.
Right. Such a good answer. And I think as Christians to see, as Susan said, that she wants all of God's children to know that they are beloved. And I want to tie that with what you're saying, to see the image of God in every human person, in children that others have dismissed or ignored or written off or downplayed, to genuinely empower them to I don't want to say fulfill potential, because that doesn't sound right. But to see in them, what was your language, Nicole? To see that everyone,
I think it's to see that everyone has a purpose, really, and allow them to flourish. And our schools right now, the way the outcomes are happening and how they're set up, largely are not allowing every child to flourish.
So good.
That's the perfect word, flourishing. Yeah.
Well, I realize that we are at time. This went super fast, y'all. Can you give us the next slide, Catherine? I need to thank all of the participants. I need to thank all of you who showed up. The recording will be available, and we'll have that posted. Catherine, thank you so much for working in the background. These slides will be made available, and along with the slides that you have seen, there are also slides for future webinars that VTS and Lifelong Learning are offering. We are hoping to have ongoing conversations. So those of you who are here, I'm hoping that you will go to the Southern Education Foundation website, that you'll go to the Expectations Project and become, if you aren't already, a partner for advocacy, that you will join in the work that Nicole and Raymond are doing. If you're in North Carolina or South Carolina, that you will think about joining Susan and her work. And if you're in another place, figure out how you might be able to replicate that, to do a jazz improvisation on that in careful and faithful ways. And I remain hopeful that there are things that we can and should and must do. And I pray that the Holy Spirit will empower you to figure out what that is, and then to give you the courage to do it. So peace be with you until we see you again, perhaps in a future Zoom office hour, and God willing that we might be able to meet in person safely before too long. And if y'all would type some thanks into the chat for the folks who have been with us, I would be really grateful. VTS is a hospitable community, so let's thank our peoples.
Thank you so much. Take care, everyone.
Good
Bye.
job.
Thank you.
Susan, I know you need to get to class, so peace be with you.
Bye.